Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
A warning to our listeners, some of the topics discussed in this podcast may be disturbing. If you need support, please contact your local crisis line or helpline. And if you're in Hong Kong and you'd like to call the Samaritans hotline, you can call them on 2896 0000. Welcome to Hong Kong Confidential. I'm Jules Hannaford and I'm your host. I'm an Australian woman and I've been living in Hong Kong for many years. I'm a mother, a teacher, an author, and I want to share my wisdom and the wisdom of others with you. Thanks for joining me and I hope you enjoy the show.
Have you ever wondered why people live in the desert? I'm Dawn Davis, and I host Desert Lady Diaries podcast. It's a weekly conversation with women who found their home in the Mojave Desert. Each week, I talk to women who were either born and raised in the desert or felt called to come here and what the desert means to them. You can learn more about the podcast and listen at desertladydiaries.com.
Today, I'm here with Dr. Hannah Sugarman. Hi, Hannah. Oh, can I call you Hannah?
Hannah is just fine.
Hi,
yes.
Dr. Hannah. Thank you so much for joining me today.
No problem.
Hannah, you're a psychologist in Hong Kong. How did you decide to get into psychology as a career?
So the first time I studied psychology was at A level in the UK, and I really enjoyed the subject. I just found it really fascinating. I knew I wanted to do something in healthcare. I think I've always probably been a bit too squeamish to be a doctor. So I decided to carry on with a sort of further study in psychology. At university, I really enjoyed it. And I thought what's really nice about it, if you go along the clinical psychology route, which is what my training is that you get to combine study and research with your clinical work as well. So it's quite unique in that sense that you don't have to stop studying. So although it involves a lot of study, and at times I've thought maybe too much.
It's a hard course, isn't it, psychology?
It can be at times. The clinical training is quite intensive. You're having to juggle quite a lot of different things. And so it's 7 years of university total.
That's a lot, isn't it? It really is when you consider that most degrees are 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, so that's 3 degrees total.
All right. So it's your undergrad in psychology, master's, and then clinical. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So it's a long slog, but all of it, I'm sure I didn't feel this way all the time when I was doing it, but it was really enjoyable and really interesting. And I just think it can be an exhausting job at times, but it's just so rewarding to be able to work with people who are experiencing mental health problems and to help them when a lot of them feel like they just don't know where to turn and they don't know how to get help.
I'm sure it could be super rewarding. I also think it could be very stressful. I do know some psychologists who have changed careers because it became very overwhelming, I think, to be dealing with people's problems day in and day out. And, I think you have to have a certain type of resilience, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I think it depends on the structure you have around you as well. So we're encouraged to have a lot of professional support. So if you have that set up, we have supervision from a more experienced psychologist or peer supervision where a group of us meet and discuss things we found difficult. So that's incredibly helpful. But I know when I was working in the public sector in the UK, a lot of people do burn out working in this kind of career, like any helping profession, because there just aren't the resources to support the professionals who are doing it. So
do you feel like you're better resourced out here in Hong Kong? I guess because you're in the private sector.
Yeah, so working privately, you get to structure your own time. And so that helps a lot. But you also have to seek out a lot of the professional support that's provided for you very automatically in the public sector. You have to find that yourself in the private sector. So I'm very lucky to have found some excellent supervisors, and I have some really lovely peers and colleagues who make it less stressful. But yeah, there are still some days where it's easy to think about other careers.
Yeah, for sure.
Like everyone, I'm sure.
I'm sure. Did you specialize in any area during your degree?
So the way it works, you're actually sort of trained as a bit of a jack of all trades when you do clinical training, at least in the UK. I know it's set up differently elsewhere. But the area that's always really interested me has been neuropsychology, which is the study of the brain and how that links to behavior. And so I did specialize in that when I was in the UK. So I worked in a stroke team supporting people who had not just strokes, other neurological illnesses. and impairments, so brain injuries and multiple sclerosis and Parkinson's disease and that kind of thing. Because of the cognitive impairments you get after those conditions, quite a big role for psychologists, both in helping people to make sense of that, the changes in their thinking, but also in supporting them emotionally after such a huge life change that they're experiencing. So that was my absolute favorite area to work in.
Sounds amazing. And in actual fact, I had a girl on my podcast, episode 50, stroke. She was 31 and she had a stroke in Hong Kong.
Oh, wow.
And she talked very much about how finding the psychological support was very difficult. You can get the rehab treatment support, but to have that sort of psychological support was a lot harder, and it was really, really what she needed. So yeah, so interesting.
Yeah, and unfortunately it's not really set up here. So psychology isn't really part of the pathway for people who experience stroke in Hong Kong, as your guest will have talked about. I'm sure I'll definitely have to check out that podcast.
Yeah, do check it out. Episode 50. It's actually my most downloaded podcast of all of my podcasts.
Wow, really?
Yeah,
well,
it's really very, very amazing and moving. Yeah, she was an amazing guest, and she was only 31 when she had the stroke. She had a dissection in her neck. She'd been in 2 years in recovery when she came on. It's a really amazing story. And certainly the psychological support was the part that she found the hardest to find.
I'm sure. And as I said, I don't know if it's the same in the public sector. I'd imagine it's slightly different. But because of so particularly for expats who experience strokes, so people who aren't local Cantonese speakers, psychology just isn't really part of the rehab support that you do get. So I have managed to work with a couple of people and be connected with them who have experienced strokes here, but it doesn't really form a huge part of my client base, partially because the expat population are young and healthy, and strokes in young and healthy people do happen, but they're relatively rare. And so I'm not seeing that very much. Yeah. But also because people just don't know it's out there.
No, they don't. And a friend of mine, her grandma had a stroke, and she was saying to me, you know, where can I get the psychological support? So it's great to know that you have that experience so that people can reach out to you.
Yeah,
that's really good to know.
And I love working with those clients.
So there you go. Yeah. So anyone experiencing stroke or Parkinson's or multiple sclerosis or anything like that, get in touch with Hannah and we'll give her details at the end of the podcast.
Wonderful.
So Hannah, do you think mental health issues are on the rise at the moment?
So the research seems to suggest that they are. And a lot of people have speculated about whether that's an artifact of increased awareness and recognition, because it's certainly true that worldwide we're talking a lot more about mental health problems. And so I think there's a lot more awareness of what they are and people are recognizing them, which is great. But I was having a look into it recently, and it seems as though the rise in mental health problems isn't just accounted for by that. So it does seem to be the case that the prevalence is going up.
Do you know what some of the other triggers or causes of mental health are? I imagine social media could be one of them.
Yeah. So do you mean in terms of why is it increasing?
Yeah. Why is it increasing? What are sort of the triggers for mental health? I'm guessing stress and commitments and, pressure would be one, and social media would be another. What else would be?
Yeah. So the way we think about it as psychologists is that we use what we call a biopsychosocial model. So we think about factors from all of those areas. So the biological factors like genetics and heredity, as well as substances and
like drugs and alcohol.
Indeed, yes. And psychological factors, so coping styles and many other, just the way that you make sense of events that happen to you and use some of the patterns that have developed in your family, for example, and the social as well. So social and environmental, so including family relationships or other relationships and just life events. So all of those things form a bit of a cocktail, and they sort of can lead to mental health problems. There's definitely factors in society today that are probably not helping, that fall into one or more of those boxes. So I guess across the world, there's quite a bit of economic uncertainty. And we know that mental health problems are much more prevalent in people with lower socioeconomic backgrounds.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. And it's a factor that really doesn't help. And so although mental health problems don't discriminate, they can be seen across all levels of society. It's definitely a factor that, as we can all imagine, increases stress if you're facing economic uncertainty and financial difficulties. But I think that social media component is something that's relatively new. And it's certainly something that, in my opinion, is the cons seem to outweigh the pros at the moment, certainly for young people, because what we have is just constant sources of comparison between these idealistic lives that people are presenting. Is not realistic, but we're constantly being bombarded with images of people whose lives look much better than ours, and we can't help but compare ourselves. And so there's studies coming out now that it's evidence-based that our social media use increases depression.
Oh, that's interesting. And also there's the whole addiction aspect and the dopamine releasing with the likes and the notifications and the messages and that adrenaline that's released when you get these kind of pings. And that's a part of it as well, isn't it? So there's a whole sort of group of kids that are becoming addicted to it.
It's designed that way. It's incredibly reinforcing. I think I was listening to a podcast actually the other day where they were talking about how the things that we used to get that kind of reinforcement from were much more about connection in person. So you say something and people laugh. Whereas now it's like you post a photo, how many likes am I going to get? And that is the reinforcement that we're seeking now. And it is incredibly effective and it's incredibly easy to form a bit of a cycle. I certainly know that I'm guilty of this, that it's become a habit. Like I'll just pick up my phone and look at social media without even thinking about it. And I really have to check in with myself and say, what am I getting out of this?
Me too. I absolutely have the habit. And because of my podcast and my book, I'm using social media as a way of marketing those. And so that level of my connection to social media has grown. But at the same time, I wish I could let it go, but I can't. Do you think that there is a stigma associated with mental health?
I think that there is. And unfortunately, I think that this stigma is very much alive and well, particularly in Hong Kong. So that's a real stark difference that I've noticed working here compared to in the UK. There's certainly stigma in the UK and there's a long way to go, but there have been initiatives in the UK to really, really target it. And there's evidence that it's changing. Whereas here, I was looking into this recently that there was a study that was published this year and they interviewed psychiatric patients and they found that there was no difference in the level of stigma that they experienced about their mental health between 2001 and 2017.
No way that it hasn't really changed.
No, unfortunately not. So there's a long way to go.
And why do you think that is? Do you think it's cultural?
I think that there are cultural factors. So from what I've learned in my time here, there's an incredible emphasis on saving face.
This is in Chinese culture.
In Chinese culture, certainly, that there is huge pressure to perform and this reputation is very important. And so it's very, very tough for people to admit that they're struggling. But I also think just even factors like the way that mental health has been talked about, certainly thinking about local culture. So I know that term for schizophrenia used to be an incredibly pejorative term. So there's been a huge movement recently. They've actually introduced a new word to talk about psychosis and schizophrenia to try and make it less stigmatizing. I'm sure there'd be people who could elaborate on that much more than I could, but it really struck me that they're even having to look at the language that they're using to try and change some of the stigma because it's so entrenched in this society.
And I think in Chinese culture, it's that seeking help, actually stepping out and asking for support, which is really difficult because of there's a real sort of sweeping it under the carpet or keep it in the family or, as you say, saving face. And I think that hopefully podcasts like this, and there's a lot of groups like Mind Hong Kong and Central Health and all of these places that are doing workshops and talks, and the Talking Mental podcast with Aaron. And there's a lot going on that's starting to build the conversation around mental health. And certainly in the international schools, we're embracing Mental Health Awareness Week and doing stuff to educate the students. So hopefully we'll see some change. Are you hopeful that we'll see change in Hong Kong, or do you feel that it's a bit too little too late, or it's a bit too tokenistic?
No, I am really hopeful. I think that things are moving in the right direction. I actually work with Mind Hong Kong quite a lot, and there are some fantastic projects going on that are about increasing awareness and just getting the conversation going. And I know that there are lots of things going in Hong Kong that are really encouraging. So like the podcast that you spoke about. So that's Aaron's podcast is fantastic. And it's great to hear that things are happening in schools as well. So I know that Mind Hong Kong, for example, have a whole project that's about youth mental health. And I know that there are other organizations like Kelly Support who do really, really great things, and probably many others that I have forgotten or I'm not aware of that are doing some really good things. I think it's just about how to reach a really wide audience. I mean, I'm very mindful that certainly I come across a very small part of the population because I don't speak Cantonese. And so it's really important that we think about stigma initiatives that can reach everyone.
What are some of the stigma initiatives that could be implemented? I mean, we've got the podcast, we've got these days. Is there anything else? Like I was actually thinking about the National Are You OK Day in Australia. You know, wouldn't it be great if the government had some sort of Are You OK Day in Hong Kong? I mean, we have mental health awareness, but is that backed by the government or is that just picked up? It's sort of more international and it's just picked up by different groups.
I think it's more international and it's just been picked up. And so that's a really good starting point. And there are initiatives by the Hong Kong government. And they have a campaign called Joyful, which is about like trying to recognize the things that make you happy.
Oh, that's great.
So there's the Joyful campaign. I know some things that I think have made a huge difference in the UK. They have these really great advertising campaigns. So there are initiatives like Time to Change. So they get celebrities to talk about their own mental health, which is incredibly useful. And actually has been backed by research that it makes a big difference. That kind of thing is incredibly effective, just making it part of the conversation, particularly for young people. If they're seeing people they admire talking about it the way that they talk about their physical health, then it's something that is normal to talk about. But the other thing that's really great, and I hope that in time we could think about introducing this kind of thing here, is that they have videos that really target particular areas of stigma. So for example, there's a particular campaign targeted at men's mental health. So we know that it's the leading cause of death in young men, suicide. We know that, well, as a stereotype, and this is of course not true for everyone, but there's a stereotype that men find it harder to speak out and talk to their friends when they are struggling. And so there's a really memorable video that Mind UK released a couple of years ago, which shows like a group of men working in quite like a laddie setting. I think it's mechanic or something like that. And it's showing the men just going up to one of their friends and talking to him about his mental health. I definitely encourage people to have a look at it.
It'll be on YouTube, wouldn't it?
It is on YouTube, yeah. I can't remember the name of it. I can double check that.
Well, it might be UK Mind Mental Health Campaign or something like that. Yeah, so, something along those lines.
Yeah, it'll be under something like that. I can't remember the name of the campaign. But just things like that, I think they're reaching out. It's not in your face. It's just reaching out in quite an accessible, approachable way, just to get people to think about this stuff a little bit more.
Do you think that women have relationships with other women where they can share more and open up more and dig deeper emotionally, and men don't have that same opportunity because of gender roles in society, perhaps? Do you think that that's what's going on? And so women get a little bit more support, or they find it easier to talk about stuff than men?
I think that definitely can be the case. It's certainly not the situation for everyone, but, you know, I know that there are lots of men who will reach out or who have really supportive friendships where they can have those kinds of conversations. But in my experience, both my anecdotal, just clinical experience and from personal experience, does tend to be a little bit easier for women in terms of the way that their friendships are set up, that they can talk to their friends when they're struggling, or they can reach out to friends when they think they might be struggling. Whereas it's a little bit more unusual, I think, for that to be the norm in male friendships. And that's also the case for therapy. I see probably an even split of men and women, actually, but a lot of the conversations that I have with some of my male clients are about that, or about how it took me a long time to get here because I just don't really like talking about my feelings. And I think I see that in men more than women.
And is it also they're afraid of appearing weak or afraid of failing and having these sort of negative masculine traits?
I think that could definitely play a role for some people, yes, because mental health seems to just be tied in more to our personality. So if you are experiencing depression, then unfortunately some of the outdated, erroneous narratives about that are that it means you're weak. Just, pull yourself out of it.
Yeah, pull up your bootstraps and get on with it. But it doesn't work that way. You can't necessarily control anxiety or depression or being bipolar. So you have to get some sort of support from a psychiatrist or a psychologist or a counsellor.
Absolutely. If it has reached that point, then it's true that you can't just get out of it. You can't just stop worrying or think positive and that's going to solve the problem. And so I think a lot of people, when they are in that place and they haven't reached out for support, it's really easy to feel like it's a reflection on you as a person. And so I do wonder, and I'm sure that is the case across both men and women, but I think particularly for men, there are sometimes ideas out there about, just be a strong masculine man and just get on with it, and men don't show their feelings. And I really hope that that's changing, because I think those narratives have caused a lot of problems over the years, and there are some really fantastic advocates for men's mental health who speak out about this. So there's a guy called Johnny Benjamin in the UK. He's on Twitter. He talks a lot about this sort of thing. I think that needs to be a target for change. And so it's really important that our stigma reducing initiatives really focusing on that, amongst many other things.
Why do you think within society there is more of a taboo on mental health issues than physical issues? Why is it okay for us to say, oh, I've broken my arm, or, I've just had bronchitis and I'm not feeling well, but we can't say, oh, I'm depressed, or I'm, feeling low, or I'm anxious. Why do you think that's the case?
I think that taboo is because of the way that mental health has been talked about in the past, seen as something that's tied in more to you as a person. So I don't think that many of us would judge someone for, say, having a broken leg or for having high blood pressure, but we may be quicker to jump to judgments about someone who has an anxiety disorder, for example. So we might just say, oh, they're just a nervous person, or they're just stressy. We seem to assign it to their personality and link it to that, rather than seeing it as a condition.
Oh, that's really interesting. That makes sense. Yes. So it's almost a bit of blame placing.
Yeah. And I think that people experiencing mental health problems can feel like that themselves as well. Like, what's wrong with me? Other people seem to cope with that. And that's not necessarily true. In fact, there's a lot of people out there who aren't coping so well and aren't really talking about it. I think that can make it hard. We call that self-stigma, can make it really hard for people to speak up because they see it as something that's wrong about them. It's something that's broken.
Yeah, and that's very sad.
It's really sad.
Everybody suffers from worries or bad days or feeling sad or feeling low. It's normal. So how does somebody know when their anxiety or their low mood or whatever is beyond what's normal and they need to seek help?
So we have a very simple way of defining that, and it comes down to your functioning. So by that, we mean, are you able to do the things you want to do and do the things that you need to do in your life? So we're talking about work, relationships, so
eating,
your
sleeping,
general functioning.
Yeah.
Exactly. So all the day-to-day things. At the point where your mental health is making it difficult for you to function, that's when we would say it tips over into something that you might need support with. And that doesn't necessarily need to be professional support, but it's something that definitely needs closer attention.
What would be a first port of call, perhaps, if you weren't going to go straight for a counsellor or a psychologist? What sort of support could you look for in that situation?
So I guess there's a couple of things before you might go down the route of a psychologist or a counsellor. So just seeking out support from your friends and your family, if you're feeling that way, is going to be really important. The other thing you can do if you don't feel that you want to or you're ready to go for professional support would be to just learn a bit more about it. So there's some really fantastic information out there about mental health. Mind Hong Kong is adapting a lot of the Mind UK resources. So that's available in both languages, but for a huge selection of resources, there's also the Mind UK website. So for information about just what it is that you're dealing with, and you might learn a bit more about things that you can do yourself. So there are some excellent self-help resources out there online, so that if you feel like you want to try a few things yourself, just to put them into place and see if that makes the difference for you, then that might be the thing that makes the difference that you need to see.
That might be all you need. So what might some of those suggestions be, like meditation and exercise?
Exercise is fantastic for mental health. That's definitely something that I'd always encourage people to try and include. It doesn't have to be a really strenuous sport or intensive weights class or anything like that.
It can be a walk,
It can be anything that you enjoy that's physical. The important thing is that you enjoy it. It's not something that's a chore for you, but like a walk with a friend, for example, and you get to tie in that connection as well, just having a chat, which can be much easier actually when you're not face to face. So that's actually a really nice thing that we can all do for our mental health.
That's a little top tip. It is easier to share when you're doing an activity with somebody rather than sitting across the table with them.
Definitely.
Yeah.
There's something quite intense about maintaining eye contact while you're talking about something really difficult.
There's something really nice about getting back to nature as well. Nature can be really good for the soul, can't it, as well?
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
Are mental health issues innate or situational or both?
So we would think of them as both. I know when I was studying psychology, I used to joke with my peers about when you're writing a psychology essay, you basically always sit on the fence, because we always end up saying something like it's a combination. But the truth is that it's that nature-nurture debate. And we think that it's the case that some people are predisposed, so they're more likely to experience mental health problems. And that might be mental health problems in the family. So there might be a genetic or a biological link there, but also because we tend to learn from the behavior of people around us. And so we might have learned phobias, for example, like when we're young. If we see our parents being very, very afraid of something, then it's quite likely that we might develop a similar phobia. And then there are also, so as I was saying before, we've got the social factors like life events and environmental factors. So things like money issues, we know that they influence mental health. And then psychological factors. So our thinking styles, the way that we respond to things that happen to us. So our reactions, how we make sense of our feelings, and what we do when we're feeling like we're struggling. So I guess an example would be you might be biologically predisposed to get depression, so you're more likely to experience it. If you're having a particularly tough time, say you're experiencing a stressful time at work, you suffer a bereavement, you're having money issues, and then because you're feeling lower, you tend to withdraw because you think people don't want to be around me when I'm feeling this way. I just want to stay in. I just feel exhausted. And so as a result, the depression symptoms get worse. So all of those things come together to form the mental health problems. It's not just one or the other.
It can also be a case where somebody who's suffering from depression may also feel that they don't deserve help because they feel so unworthy. And then that can make it hard to reach out as well, can't it?
Yeah, so people with low mood and depression make predictable errors in their thinking. And that's the way that we'd understand it. So people's thinking becomes very negative. And as you said, when it reaches a really severe point, it actually starts to interfere with the way that you see yourself. And so you're right that you think, well, I feel this bad about myself, that I'm not worthy, I'm a failure, people don't want to be around me, the world will be a better place without me. And we could see where that gets into a really risky territory, because if people really strongly believe that, as they do when they are in that phase of depression, they're not that likely to seek help. And they might actually get to the point where they start to think about harming themselves. And so that's the point where they most need the help.
What can we do to help in that situation? I guess it's up to friends and family to sort of take notice, isn't it, of when people are withdrawing or when their behaviors have changed significantly, and then asking the question about, are you thinking of hurting yourself, or are you feeling suicidal? Like, I did that suicide assist course recently, and it's actually fine to ask people directly how they're feeling or whether they're feeling suicidal. And then once you've got that answer, then you need to put something into place to give them support. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. So I'm aware of the assist course. I haven't done that course myself, but I'm actually a mental health first aid trainer. And it sounds like there's quite a bit of overlap in terms of the topics that we cover. And one of them is supporting someone who's feeling suicidal. I think a very common myth. I certainly know that before I started working in mental health, I believed this myth myself, that if you ask someone if they're feeling suicidal, maybe you're going to make them more suicidal. And that's why people are really worried to ask that question. And it's totally understandable. It's a really tough conversation to have. But as you said, it's not true that...
You're not going to give them the idea. They're not going to go, oh, that's a good idea. Perhaps I'll do it.
Unfortunately, chances are if someone's feeling that bad, that it has occurred to them. And so you're absolutely right. You're not going to make someone feel worse by asking them. It's, of course, important to ask it in a compassionate and sensitive way,
yes,
non-judgmental way.
Yeah.
But that said, asking them is far more likely to be helpful. It's not going to make someone worse. Of course, as I said, it is a tough conversation, and I wouldn't want anyone to feel responsible, like they have to be the one having that conversation. So if you feel like you're not best placed to have that conversation because it's a loved one or it's someone you don't feel comfortable with, then you can still have a role in supporting them to connect with someone they can have that conversation with. So even the GP, like if they have a good relationship with their GP, perhaps you can support them to go and see the GP and with their permission, give the GP a heads up that you're a little bit worried about them. And then the doctor will be asking them those questions.
That's really good advice. That's excellent advice. And just for anyone out there who's listening, if they're having any suicidal feelings or thoughts, what would you advise them to do?
So if someone's at the point where they're thinking about ending their life, I mean, that just shows me how much pain they must be in. And so if you are feeling like that, it might be hard to believe that you could feel better. But the fact is that you can, and there are things that can help. So if anyone is feeling that way, I'd encourage them to seek out support wherever they feel comfortable to do so. So that might be with friends and family, or you might feel more comfortable speaking to someone more objective. So whether that is using one of the telephone lines that's available. So I know in Hong Kong and many other countries, there are the Samaritans and support services like that, or going down the professional route. So you can speak to your GP or seek out support from a mental health professional like a counselor, a psychologist, a psychiatrist. I mean, that is the biggest step often, is getting into the room with a professional. But once you've done that, that can be the hardest part. And from then on, it's about recovery and helping you to get back to your life so that these feelings don't bother you as much.
That's great advice, and it can be a great turning point. And I do know also that there are some really good websites like Beyond Blue in Australia. That's a very good website. You can go there and you can get direct support from those websites and advice. And I'm sure there's similar ones in the UK as well, but I don't know what they're called. But Beyond Blue is a great one.
Definitely. I actually find myself using a lot of Australian resources. There's some fantastic stuff out there.
Yeah, Aussies are on top of this, I think. They really are.
There's some really, really great charities in Australia and great initiatives as well. I know Mind Hong Kong is taking a lot of knowledge from some very kind people who've been lovely enough to share with us. But another one from Australia, it's called CCI. It's the Centre for Clinical Interventions. They have a lot of workbooks and information sheets about different mental health problems. So it's basically self-help. So a mixture of just learning, so how you can recognize mental health problems in yourself or other people, but also really practical. I mean, it's basically the things that you would do in therapy, but just working through them yourself. And so if you want to have a look at some of the things that you might do, say if you're feeling low and you want to know what you would do to help yourself, then I definitely encourage you to have a look at that.
And that's brilliant because some people don't have the financial means to access help. So that's a great resource. And I'll put links to these in the show notes so that people can access them if they need it. And I do know also that the Are You OK Day in Australia also have a website where you could get support if you needed it. So that's awesome. So if you're not feeling great, please get support because as Hannah said, you're not always going to feel this low. There is help available. Do you have any practical tips for how friends and family can support somebody who's really struggling with their mental health?
I think we talk quite a bit about this in the mental health first aid program, that it's really important to remember your role. So of course you feel responsible if it's someone that you're very close to and someone that you love. And of course you want to do anything that you can to support them. You need to remember that it is not your responsibility to make them able to feel better. But if you can get them to the right support, then that can be incredibly valuable. So I guess if you're having this kind of conversation, what you need to be conveying to them is that you really, really care. As we said before, it needs to be non-judgmental. So just saying things like, I'm really sorry to hear that you're feeling that way. I can understand that it must be really scary for you to be having these kinds of thoughts. And then not forcing them, but just encouraging them to seek the appropriate help. And then seeing if there is anything that you can do practically to help them out and to relieve stress for them.
Really, and this is what I learned on the Suicide Assist course, it's about making them safe in the moment and getting them the support that they need.
Yeah.
You don't have to solve the problem. You don't have to fix it. You're not responsible for keeping them alive forever. It's just in the moment it's called first aid, that, like you said, mental health first aid. So you're just doing the first aid in the moment.
Exactly. I mean, we draw a parallel with physical health first aid because I think the lines are a bit more blurred with mental health. So with physical health first aid, we've all done those excellent basic life support groups where we have to embarrass ourselves with a dummy. And when we do that, we don't come out of that course thinking that we should be doctors and we should be qualified to treat and keep someone alive. What we're doing is doing the basic skills needed to get someone to the help that they need. And so we shouldn't put that pressure on ourselves with mental health. If you're not a mental health professional, then of course you should not know how to make someone feel better. Unfortunately, even mental health professionals sometimes don't know how to do that. And so you need to remember that your role, as you said, is in connecting them to the right support where you can and keeping them safe as much as you can in the moment. But remembering that if you're doing that, it's not your responsibility to act in the ways that a professional would. And also acknowledging the impact on you of having these conversations, particularly with someone that you care about. It's really, really hard on you to talk to someone who is feeling really low, or particularly someone who's talking about harming themselves. And so look after yourself when you're having these conversations and be kind to yourself about it.
Yeah, that's good advice. You've got to have your self-care as well. Do you think that suicide rates are on the rise at the moment?
It seems as though they are in the US. I know it's been quite publicized because there's some quite alarming statistics about this, that there's been a 30% increase in between the year 2000 and the year 2016, which is just, I mean, it's really, really scary.
Yeah.
There has been an increase worldwide as well. So generally, yes.
And then are there any studies that you're aware of that can tell us what the causes of this are?
People have speculated on it, certainly in the research. I mean, here you go. I'm sitting on the fence again. It's hard to ascribe one cause, but I think, as we were talking about before, mental health problems are increasing. And we think that there are a number of factors that might be relevant here. And I'm sure that I will by no means cover them all, but I think some things that we're seeing a lot of is that economic uncertainty again. Of course, people's futures are very uncertain. There's a lot of pressure on people to perform in societies that just don't make it easy for them. And there's also the impact of technology. So technology can be just great for mental health. And I realized that I spend so long waxing lyrical about how bad social media is for our mental health that we fail to acknowledge that how wonderful it is that we can connect with people across the world, and also that it provides a platform for people to talk about their mental health. So in some ways it's great, but in other ways we aren't getting that face-to-face human connection that is so important for any of our mental health. And so I think that that's a massive contributing factor. So I know that I see a lot of articles out there about like the loneliness epidemic, that loneliness is increasing. So despite us being more connected than ever, a lot of people are reporting that they're feeling very lonely. And so I wonder whether that is a factor.
And people are living longer. So there's a lot of people living to an older age and they're often alone as well.
They're often alone. They're often experiencing physical health problems. So life is quite difficult for a lot of people when they reach those more elderly ages that people just weren't reaching even 10, 20 years ago. And there's some really worrying statistics about that, actually, that the rates of suicide are very high in the elderly. In fact, Hong Kong has the highest elderly suicide rate in the world.
Oh, wow. That's really sad. But that also is interesting because Chinese culture, families are typically very connected and supportive of the elderly, like in more ways than perhaps Western culture. So I'm surprised that that's a high statistic.
I know. And it was surprising. And I remember when I first learned about this, speaking about this with some of my colleagues and talking about some of the factors that might be at play here. And I guess if people who are elderly with a lot of health needs might feel that they don't want to burden their families because they know that the tradition is that the families will give things up to look after them. And that puts a lot of pressure on the person themselves.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The best explanation I've had is that in terms of caring for physical health, and particularly when we're talking about crisis, so emergency care, Hong Kong is really good for that. So you can get to a hospital very, very quickly because we're all packed in a very compact area. So physical health problems tend to be treated very, very quickly, which means that things like strokes and heart attacks, which are big leading causes of death in the elderly, are treated very, very well. But that means that people are living longer to older ages with many chronic physical health problems, but the acute problems are being treated. And so that doesn't really address their mental health. Their quality of life might be quite low. And there's not, as far as I know, huge amount of social support out there for the elderly in Hong Kong. And although they're living longer, the quality of life is maybe not where it could be.
Hannah, how important do you think mindfulness practices are for improving your well-being?
I think mindfulness is excellent. I am a big, big fan of it. I think it can be used really, really well for all of us to help us with our mental health. I think there's a lot of misunderstandings out there about mindfulness. I mean, we'll try not to get on my soapbox about it.
No, feel free, get on it.
I guess many people see it as relaxation. And if it's providing relaxation, then there's absolutely no problem with using it in that way. So lots of people will listen to Headspace before they go to sleep and they find that it really, really helps them to empty their mind. But then what I get is people that I'm working with saying things like, couldn't do it. I couldn't empty my mind. And so I'll often say to them, well, good. Your mind's not supposed to be empty.
Yeah, that's not what meditation is necessarily about, is it?
No.
So there's a bit of a misconception.
Exactly. So the way that we use mindfulness when someone's experiencing worsening mental health is to help them to lessen the attachment to some of the thoughts and feelings that are causing them distress. So if they're having lots of negative thoughts, mindfulness helps you to become more of an observer of those thoughts rather than seeing the thoughts as facts or commands, because you can enable yourself to see them as things that come and go. And so in that sense, it really, really helps you to be less trapped and less pushed around by negative thoughts and feelings. So I think that misconception about my mind was busy and I couldn't empty it can be quite unhelpful when it comes to mindfulness, because we're not expected to have empty minds. We've got these wonderful busy brains that help us out a lot of the time. So we don't need to try and quieten them. I just think we need to look at how attached we can get to some of that negative stuff sometimes.
Yeah, and then you just need to look at ways for self-care, and it can be just whatever works for you, whether it's listening to a podcast or going swimming or doing meditation or yoga or Pilates or sport or reading or art or painting. There's so many things that we can do that give us pleasure, and creativity is very good for the soul as well. I've said that 7 million times on this podcast, but in other episodes, but it's true, isn't it? You know, journaling, there's so many things that you can do, coloring in. And I think that if people just take that time, then it can really just help reset and give them more energy.
Yes, definitely. And mindfulness doesn't just have to be about mindful breathing. I know you referred to coloring there, which is a really good one. I'll find a lot of people who I meet either as clients or people I'm chatting to will say, oh, I'm not into all of that hippie rubbish. And so
they think they've got to dress like a hippie and sit under a tree and have incense burning. And it's like, it's not.
Exactly. That's it. Being mindful is something that we're all doing from time to time, whether we like it or not. So it's just bringing our awareness to that a little bit more. And you can be mindful when you're washing the dishes or mindful when you're walking. It doesn't have to be mindfulness meditation.
No, and in a way, it's taking time for yourself. That's all it is. And we live such busy, stressful lives that if you take that time for yourself, it can positively impact your well-being and your mental health.
It definitely can. And some of the other things you were referring to, I find myself saying this a lot, and I know it's easier said than done, but we're all, as you said, we're all so busy. We're all just absolutely, our days are packed with things. And when life gets busier, the self-care seems to just be the first thing to go.
It does for me, for sure.
For me as well. And so I really have to try and practice what I preach here.
Yeah,
but
me too.
It's so true that there are a few things that keep us all well, and we need to make sure that we're doing them. So even if you're going through a particularly busy time at work and it's not possible to do everything that you would usually do to keep you feeling like yourself, it might just be like a diluted version of that maybe. So you can't get out for your hour's walk at lunchtime. Go out for 10 minutes and just walk around and reset. Just make sure that you're not completely eliminating that stuff.
That was my final question, was how can somebody make an immediate change in their daily lives if they're currently struggling with their mental health? And you've kind of covered it. Get out and walk. Just do something different. Take time for yourself. Is there anything else that you can suggest?
I think it's just the awareness of that. The self-care is so easy to dismiss. And it's funny because we're not so much like that about our physical health, although maybe somewhat, but we're much more aware of the things that keep us physically well. And we know we're meant to get good sleep and exercise and healthy eating. And most of us at least pretend to try to do that stuff a lot of the time.
Yeah.
But we don't do that with our mental health. We say, oh, well, I just forget sleeping well tonight. I've got all this work to do, or my walk at lunchtime can wait because I'm too busy. And so I think I'd just say most basic, simple level, just think of one thing that you could do for yourself that you're not doing at the moment, and just see if you can try it out for a week and see what difference it makes. It doesn't have to be anything big. It could be, like I said, walking at lunchtime if it isn't excruciatingly hot.
Or pouring with rain.
Or pouring with rain. But the good thing about Hong Kong is there's lots of malls to walk through, air-conditioned dry malls. Or even like getting up 15 minutes earlier so that you can have a cup of tea and read the paper. Just one small thing that's going to be realistic for you to do, and just try it out. And after a week, if you don't like it, well, then you can just chuck that one away. But
yeah, and it's small goals then. Doesn't seem insurmountable.
Exactly.
Well, Dr. Hannah Sugarman, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today to talk about mental health. It's such an important topic. And I really feel that my listeners are going to get so much out of this. So thank you so much for coming and sharing your knowledge.
You're so welcome. It's a pleasure to be here.
How can people get in touch with you if they would like to get advice or come and see you as a psychologist? How can they do that?
So I have a website. It's www.reflectwell.com. reflect-well.com. So if people want to learn more about me or get in touch with me, then they can find lots of information there.
Thank you. And for my listeners out there, if this is a podcast that really resonated with you, or you have a friend or somebody in your family you think would really benefit from hearing Dr. Hannah's advice, please will you share this podcast with them? And if you could also rate us on iTunes, that would be super helpful to take me up the iTunes charts, and it will also help Dr. Hannah. Thanks very much, Hannah. It's been wonderful.
You're welcome. Good to be here.
So that brings us to the end of another Hong Kong Confidential podcast. I'm Jules Hannaford. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you'll be with me again next week. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please can you go to iTunes to rate and review it. I would really appreciate your feedback. You can email me at jules@hongkongconfidential.net, and you can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Hong Kong Confidential. If you'd like to hit me up on Twitter, it's at Jules Hannaford. I would love to hear from you.
Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to AuscastNetwork.com for details.